Let's continue with the age. The age input here is actually of type number. Now, this can be confusing. Just because it's of type number does not mean what you enter here will be treated as type number in code. It looks like a number, and you won't be able to enter anything but numbers here, but you will not automatically get a value of type number in code. Sounds confusing? Let me show you what I mean. Let's add a new data property, user age maybe, and let's set this to an empty string as well, or maybe to a number, or maybe to null. Let's maybe use null, because I don't want to use 0. I also don't want to use an empty string because it should be a number. So I will use null to make it clear that we have no value yet for this. And now let's bind user age to this input here, to this input. We can do this with vModel. That works on this input just as it did on the first one. And here I can point at user age now. Now with that, let's go down here, to the method, and I will console log user age, and I will deliberately use 2 console logs now, so that I don't concatenate the user age with a string to a longer string, but so that I keep the type of user age. And below that, I will log a random number, in this case 31. And you'll see why I'm doing this in a second. I can then also, of course, reset it back to null thereafter to also reset it in the input fields. With all of that, if we go back, I can of course still enter max here, but I can also enter 31 or 32 or whatever you want here. If I click Save Data, you see it was submitted, and you will see that 32 looks just like 31. So what's the special thing here? Well, watch what happens if I retrieve the value not with vModel, or not only with vModel, but if I also add a ref here. Age input could be the ref identifier. And with that ref added, let me go back here, and I will then console log the value of this ref's age input.value. So I'm accessing the native DOM element, and I'm then getting access to the value property, and I'm outputting this here. If I do this, and I enter 32 here, you'll see something interesting. This 32 is our internally managed data property, which is bound with vModel. This 31 is the dummy number I'm outputting here. The value which I'm outputting with refs here is this 32. And the interesting thing is that this is black and this is blue. Blue means it's of type number. Black means it's of type string. So it's a different data type. Why does this matter? Well, let's say you continue working with that number you fetched. Maybe you add 5. Let me do this in both cases, for the property we're managing in our data and for the property we're getting with refs. If I'm doing that, and I enter 32 again, we get 37 for the data property, but 325 for the ref property. And that's not a mathematical error, this is simply a concatenated string, 32 and 5 combined to one string. So the interesting thing of which you should be aware here is that vModel, if used on an input of type number, automatically fetches the user input and converts it from a string to a number data type. By default, if you would be using just JavaScript, or if you're using refs and therefore the native JavaScript object representing this input, by default, what's stored in the value is always a string. It's an extra feature added by Vue and vModel that it sees that this input is of type number and that it therefore converts this string value to a number value for you. You can also force it to do that. For example, if you use another type here, you can force Vue to do that conversion by adding a modifier after vModel here. the number modifier. This forces this conversion, which vModel does automatically here in case of type number. And speaking of these modifiers, you might have seen it already, there are a couple of other modifiers as well. The lazy modifier allows you to change how view updates the bound property. If it does this on every keystroke, or if for some inputs it does this at a lower frequency. Trim allows you to tell view that it should remove excess whitespace at the beginning and end of the text that was entered. It's the equivalent to manually doing that with the trim method on this string here. So with trim added, you ensure that you always get an input with no leading or trailing whitespace at the end, which of course is also something that could be useful. And that was a lot of talking about vModel and its modifiers and numbers, but this can be a common bug which you add to an application, that you think you got a number and actually you're working with a string. And it's especially important to be aware of this special behavior vModel offers to us, because I already mentioned earlier in the course that you can either use vModel for getting access to some data or a ref. Well, turns out you can, but behind the scenes, these two approaches have different behaviors. And if you use a ref, which is perfectly fine, you should, for example, be aware of the fact that no automatic type conversions take place. That was enough of the talking about this. With that, let's see how we can interact with all the other inputs we got on this page.